Yellow and Red makes by Digits 27, Chapter 6. Naruto was surprised at just how interested Tayuya seemed when he spoke about being a ninja. She took it in with more focus and genuine curiosity than he would have thought possible, at least for the short time he had known her. When she asked a question he did know, he would just ask QB, who would quickly tell him before he passed the information along. She didn't even seem to mind when he took these pauses to talk with his tenant. She simply thought he was thinking about the answer. To say it surprised him that this impatient, angry, and generally cold person shared an interest with him would be an understatement. However, he was of course happy that they finally had something to talk about that involved minimal swearing on her part. Unfortunately for him, her main area of interest when he began talking about the aspects of being a ninja was genjutsu. While QB had slowly been getting him to appreciate the style, he still didn't know nearly enough to satisfy her questions. Instead of asking QB every time, he sometimes simply told her that he didn't know enough about it. She seemed disappointed. It was another strange reaction he wouldn't have expected, even if she did cover it well. Even so, he could see that all her unanswered questions left her wanting for more. He offered to let her train with him, and even though she looked hesitant, especially after seeing what he could do, she tentatively agreed. He had quickly assured her that she wouldn't start off at his level after QB informed him why she seemed unsure. Since it was still morning, Naruto would usually have kept on with his physical training, but QB seemed to let him off for once, instead opting to travel a bit more. They packed up and set off at a decent pace, even if it wasn't quite as fast as Naruto or his passenger would have liked. While Naruto's night vision was now excellent, Tayuya was only human and couldn't keep the pace he set with the same confidence. If she had doubted his enhanced vision before, she disregarded that notion after seeing just how quickly he could move. Eventually, after a decent 2 hours of moving, they pulled into another clearing. Tayuya caught her breath, still unused to just how far and fast a shinobi could move, while Naruto set up the camp. After he was done, he looked at the sprawled out form of Tayuya on the ground with a smirk. He noticed that she was still wearing his black t-shirt from this morning, although she had put her old black pants back on. That only left him with with a single shirt, increasing his need to find a village or town and resupply. He left the clearing for a bit, and when she felt strong enough to stand, Tayuya joined him. After last night, she had lost her reservations. She knew there was something she was supposed to know about boys and girls bathing together, but nobody had ever really told her the specifics. Either way, she had felt sweaty after the fast paced trek of that night, and she needed to soak just as much as Naruto did. After they were finished, and Naruto had cooked them both a quick lunch, although both were ravenous, he had sat down to begin his chakra exercises. For a few minutes, Tayuya watched with curiosity until frustration set in with Naruto being so inactive. She walked over to him, watching the smoldering leaf in his hand the entire time. Before tonight, she would have been amazed that the small burning leaf in the center wasn't moving outwards, but after her lecture on chakra, she understood that many more things than she could have imagined were now possible. Naruto opened his eyes when he heard and smelled her draw closer. He chuckled sheepishly when he realized what he had done. He stood up, meeting Tayuya's irritated gaze with his own semi-apologetic grin. After that, and some less than gentle encouragement from Tayuya, he began to teach and show her how to mold and form her chakra. He was once again surprised by how quickly she took to the supposedly alien concept. Although, after displaying her aptitude for learning, he shouldn't have been shocked. That was all he could do on the first day, but he knew that Yuya showed prodigious skill for somebody completely new to being a ninja. He himself had spent 3 days just getting basic control molding down, and she seemed competent enough after the first day. He smiled a wide grin when they were done. With QB guiding him and him guiding her, they would develop greatly. Already in his mindscape, QB was adjusting her daily plan for Naruto to incorporate the girl. She knew the value of having somebody just as powerful, if maybe slightly less so, to back you up. She didn't want anything to happen to her container, so this was like an extra insurance to the ancient being. Not to mention the fact that it injected a bit of amusement into her day to watch the two kids interact. The fact that you couldn't get under Naruto's skin no matter how hard she tried was impressive to watch, even if the girl didn't realize there was a spectator to their verbal spars. Tayuya didn't realize how exhausting all the work had been until it was over. The wave of fatigue hit her like a rock, and she almost fell asleep on the spot. It was all only the cold and the fact that she didn't want to appear undignified that kept her awake. She also didn't want to be the first to fall asleep, and showed weakness which she wouldn't do in front of her companion. It didn't really matter to her that he didn't see it that way, but the rational part of her mind wasn't at 100% due to exhaustion. Naruto still had his little late night lesson with Kyubi to go. It felt unfair as Tayuya had no such advantage, but he didn't want to forego his own learning. He also saw how stubborn she was being about sleep, despite what some people believed about his perception. It was easy to see that she was fighting a losing battle with the Sandman, and while she wouldn't easily admit it, she would probably need to sleep near him for the warmth. He sighed and walked over to where she was wearily sitting and pulled out the blankets. He passed one to her as he had the previous night. He knew that she wasn't going to accept his offer of sleeping together again if he asked anyways. He lay down to sleep, or at least that was how it appeared, and waited. Sure enough, after a while, Tayuya crept over to him without him giving away any sign that he noticed or was even awake, and slept under the sheet with him, nestling closer to his body for its warmth. Because of last night, he knew it wasn't a problem, so he slipped an arm around her waist and pulled her slightly closer, masking it with incoherent muttering. He felt her freeze for a moment, her body becoming rigid before she relaxed in the position. When he finally felt her breathing steady and heard her heartbeat slow, he sighed with a smile before loosening himself to his subconscious. Juby was already waiting for him, a slight grin on the vixen's features, but she alluded to nothing as she started the lesson. This was essentially the way the rest of the week went. Naruto's training continued as normal, as did his daily routine. He would awaken, wash, eat, train, walk for a few hours, eat, train, eat, and then pretend to sleep while he had his lessons. Although this time he had a companion, Tayuya would join him in training, as it was half between him practicing and learning, whilst the rest of the time he would teach her before leaving her hours before leaving her to her own devices. This was true for both the physical and chakra exercises, although he had to exclude her from the lessons. Every night he was also the every night was also the same story. Toyu would accept the blanket before retiring some distance away in the clearing. She would then fight a losing battle against the elements on and her own mind before creeping over to Naruto and sliding under the blanket with him. He was still wondering why she bothered hiding it by the end of the week. She must know that he knew, after all, he woke up before her every day. He chuckled in his thoughts. If he could safely say that he had learned anything over the past week, and he had learned a lot, it was that the was not a morning person. He had made the mistake of knocking her slightly when he woke up one morning and had received a swift punch in the gut for his troubles. That was another thing he was noticing. While Tayuya did not have as harsh a physical regimen as he did, it was still having a noticeable effort on her speed and strength. When he had met her, she had been a rather scrawny girl. With his meals and the training they did, she was quickly filling out into more healthy proportions for somebody her age. He, of course, didn't notice that the same was true for himself. Living off of instant ramen for the past few years, and scraps before that, hadn't left him the healthiest of specimens. Now that he was eating right, with plenty of protein from the animals he caught, he too was gaining a healthier physique. He might have even noticed that he had grown a bit. Although, of all the good changes that had come out about over the week, there were some things that wouldn't change. Naruto was upset and frustrated that in all that time, the year hadn't lowered her guard emotionally even once. He tried his best to be there, even never prying too hard, but always reminding her that he was in fact there. She kept trying to distract him, almost as if she just expected him to leave her at any moment, something he definitely had no intention of doing. He had mused on it a lot, figuring he would need to make some kind of gesture to prove that he wasn't going to leave her. It was her unwillingness to change this and a few other aspects of her attitude that made it all the more surprising when the first cracks did start to show. He would remember the start of that exactly 1 week after the two had met. "Hey, shithead!" He grimaced inwardly, while on some level he had refusely accepted the nickname. He would still prefer she use his name. he used his real one, like he showed the courtesy of doing for her. However, after a while, he had managed to stop reacting to the name, which caused her to use it less often when it had less of an effect. Yes, Tayuya. He was curious to watch to what she wanted. They had just finished their dinner and were about to go to sleep, or at least she was. He immediately noticed how uncomfortable the girl seemed and had tried to be careful in the tone of his reply. She seemed to take a few moments. Whatever she wanted to say was obviously difficult. Um, about sleeping, he started to see where this was going, but acted ignorant. What is it? Do you want both the blankets tonight? I can go without them if you want. She scowled for a moment. It was still too strange for her to have somebody this selfless around. She never knew quite how to respond when he made a gesture like this. In the middle of the week, he had only managed a measly catch for their lunch, and despite his obvious hunger, he offered her the much larger share. Of course, she had acted indignant that he would think she needed more, like she was weak, deep down, she was touched. Well, no, it's not. Well, in the mornings, his semi serious expression was starting to put her off, asking what she had come over to ask, but she was a stubborn person. You, you wouldn't mind me, you know. Damn, where had the damn stutter come from? She hadn't stuttered shyly like that in years. Naruto, on the other hand, allowed a warm smile to grace his features, trying to lighten the tense atmosphere. Of course not. I offered it in the first place, remember? She narrowed her eyes. Of course she remembered. Didn't he see how uncomfortable this made her? As if he was reading her mind, Naruto gave her a penetrating look while maintaining the smile. I didn't press it. It was your choice, and I don't like pressuring people. Tuyo wasn't shaken by the answer. She was actually respecting her by not saying anything. The thoughts hadn't even crossed her mind. She scowled again at how he was yet again getting into her head, and her tone regained some of its stubborn edge. Yeah, well, I'm just letting you know I don't care anymore. It's just fucking cold out here, and I need you as a pillow, then I'm damn well going to use you like one. She glared defiantly at him, daring him to respond, but he didn't. She was a little irked when his smile didn't waver, but when he shrugged, she mentally took that as a victory and stalked away, smirking towards the river. Nato watched her leave with his own smirk. In the head, he was visualizing a massive dam of tremendous proportions. Before his eyes, a simple tiny crack appeared, and the tiniest trickle of water came gushing out. Well, it's a start. It was late on their second week together that the pair finally came across another village. This time, Naruto kept to the forest for much longer before emerging out, out onto the road right before the town itself. It was somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, so the single guard was hardly alert. He led the two young children through the gate with barely more than a glance. From their state of dress, he had assumed they were either orphans or refugees. He didn't realize how right he was. It wasn't really all that late for Tayuya or Naruto, being only about two-thirds of the way through their waking day. But the stores were all closed this early, or late depending on one's viewpoint. Instead, they opted to settle down in a quiet alley behind a restaurant and get some sleep before morning. The gentle sense of food and the sounds of the sleepy village lulled the children into sleep. If anybody had come across the scene, they may have found it cute to see two young orphans sleeping under a pair of blankets, huddled together for warmth. When morning did come, Naruto was the first to wake as usual. It was actually rather disconcerting to wake up and not immediately spring into physical exercise. It was also strange to wake up to somewhat weak daylight after so long in the dark relying on his night vision. It took him a few minutes to adjust. The light hurt in his sensitive eyes. He could only imagine that it would be worse for Tayuya. She had no night vision to rely on and would be going straight from pitch black to daylight, a prospect he be less than ecstatic about. He stretched a bit to alleviate the worst of the aches that had accumulated from sleeping on the rough alley floor. He knew he would regret his next action later, but he didn't like the idea of leaving Takia alone while he went about the town getting a sense of the land. She might have woken up and thought that he had abandoned her. After a moment or two of deliberation, he decided against waking her himself. He told himself repeatedly that it was because he felt she deserved the extra few minutes of sleep, not that he was afraid of her reaction. However, when a few minutes turned into 30, he was forced to gently shake her shoulders until her eyes blearily opened. Suddenly, they snapped apart and a sneer made its way onto her face. But before she could slug him, he leapt back and she got a look at their surroundings. The fact that they were surrounded by buildings surprised her until she remembered how they had arrived here, even more groggily at that than usual. Thanks to the near blinding sunlight, she rose up and did a few stretches herself. When they both agreed they were ready, they packed up what little they had brought out of the bag last night and walked out of the alley. Before they got out completely, Tayiya thumped him lightly on the shoulder. She had held back her full strength, but Naruto still rubbed the spot gingerly, looking at her strangely. You know how I feel about you dodging me in the morning, shithead. She didn't offer any more of an explanation as they emerged onto the quiet street. Naruto was slightly confused. The town was small, but definitely not that small. This time in the morning, there should have been people bustling to and fro on their daily businesses. Men going off to work in the surrounding mines or shops, women out getting the supplies they needed for the day or week, even kids running about being a general nuisance. He shrugged it off as one of those oddities, but his brow unconsciously furrowed a little. One look from Takia told him that she had noticed the same thing. Both of them hadn't spent enough time on the streets to understand how places like this worked. Naruto had to put it to the back of his mind as he entered the first shop on their path. It was a general store selling all the necessities for travelers like themselves, a perfect place to pick up the few things they were missing. Instead, the shop they were once again inside the shop, they were once again reminded just how quiet this place was. There wasn't a soul in the shop except for the slightly nervous-looking shopkeeper. He he idly stood behind the counter, obviously unnerved by the two children, and looking like any moment he might make a break for it. The pair didn't say anything, but eternally they were just as uncomfortable as the clerk looked. Of course, Tayuyu was better at hiding this behind her ever-present scowl, but Naruto managed to keep his emotions in long enough for them to get out and allow himself to breathe a small sigh. They hurried across the street, not wanting to spend more time than they had to in this disconcerting area. At least during the day when they couldn't help but feel vulnerable. Naruto didn't know if he was becoming paranoid, but he started to understand why QB had chosen for him to travel at night. You're welcome, kid. Although I share your concerns, I would recommend you leave this place quickly. Naruto quickly nodded his head in the affirmative, knowing that the QB would understand the gesture. As time had drawn on from his initial transformation, QB had managed to access more and more of his senses through their internal link. At first, it was strange, knowing that everything he experienced wasn't his alone, but as he got used to it, the sensation barely even registered anymore. Two training ninjas quickly entered the store, only just noticing that it was a clothes shop. Naruto was grateful. Between the two of them, they had two shirts, and no matter how much you wash something in cold water, there was a limit to what you were covering up. He smiled for the first time since noticing the strange atmosphere and turned to his companion. She was already gone, wandering up and down the aisles of the small shop, idly looking at the clothes and occasionally pulling in items off of the racks, only to put them back on after a frown. Naruto also frowned as he patted his pocket. Gamachan was a little lighter after they had bought all the necessities in the other store. It would clear him out to buy clothes for both himself, and Tahiya. At least he assumed that from the way she was dressed before and the smell of the streets that clung to her back then that she wasn't exactly rolling in Rio. Even so, he smiled as he watched the girl walk around the store. It was obviously an experience she was unused to. He snapped out of his idle thoughts after he heard a call from the vendor. It was obviously aimed in his direction, even though the man looked away from him. When Naruto turned to look, again he held that same uncomfortable aura that had surrounded the last shopkeeper. Naruto frowned again, but acting on the man's unvoiced request, he started looking through the various aisles of clothing to see what was in his price range. He was more than surprised when he started looking at the price tags. Everything was a lot cheaper here than in Konoha. In the stores back home, at least the ones he was grudgingly allowed into, the prices were at least 3 times this amount. He grinned broadly. Maybe he wouldn't be cleaned out after this after all. Of course, that smile immediately dropped off his face when he saw Tayuyo rounding the corner of the aisle. He was standing in with a bundle of clothes in her arms. There was everything there from shirts to pants to hats, gloves, shorts, a few pairs of shoes, and a jacket. There were also a few items hidden purposely further into the bundle that Naruto couldn't see, and Tayuya hoped to keep it that way. She had grown used to wearing guys' boxers in the last few weeks because there was little else for her to wear, but for some reason she wasn't alright with Naruto seeing them. His eyes bulged at the ungainly pile of clothing, marveling at how the girl had picked it all out so quickly. So, Shitin, are you just gonna stand there gawking like a pussy, or are you going to pick out some clothes? Her words snapped him out of the half dazed he had fallen into, entranced by all the colors in the pile. He shook his head and looked around for a moment. Eyes immediately rested on something that brought a wide grin to his face. Just as he was reaching for the bright orange jumpsuit, a hand caught his wrist faster than he would have believed if he hadn't seen it for himself. You touched that fucking piece of bastardized fabric some fucktard had the balls to call clothes, and I'll rip off your arms and use it to paint it a better color. Nato visibly paled from the shockingly statement, looking at the girl with eyes the size of dinner plates. When she finally realized the vice-like grip on his wrist, he returned it to his side, rubbing it slightly to get the circulation going again. The you could get shockingly strong when properly angry. What's wrong with it? Her eyes tried to bore a hole directly into his forehead. When that didn't work, she sighed. It was more out of anger and frustration than any kind of disappointment, although that was mixed in there as well. You want to be a fucking shinobi, right? She tried not to shout, but couldn't help her voice from raising a few decibels when he nodded, a bit too enthusiastically for her liking. She continued, "Then you can't go around wearing a color that practically shouts, 'I'm over here, come fucking stab me.'" Naruto furrowed his brow, taking another look at the jumpsuit on the rack before glancing back at Tayuya. He didn't see what was wrong with it. The color orange was great, but he had a hard time trying to see past Tayuya's harsh logic. Orange was terrible for camouflage in any environment. Yeah, you're right, Tayuya. She was surprised that the kid had come around so easily, expecting him to put up more of a fight. She narrowed her eyes at him, wondering what the ulterior motive was, but when he began to look around the shelves again, she loosened up. Damn right, I'm fucking right. It was more of a whisper to herself than anything else, but with his superior hearing, Naruto caught it anyways, and it brought a small smile to his face. He went around the store picking up a few items of clothing, mostly black or dark navy shirts, but he added in one large one, thinking that it wouldn't be too bad if he wore a jacket. He had picked out the perfect one, a dark green coat that was warm and comfortable while coming down past his mid-thigh. He also picked up a few pairs of black pants. They were nothing special, but they looked incredibly comfortable. All the while he had QB in his head, mentally nodding her head at his various choices. Her only real concern was whether or not they would hamper his movements. He topped off the pile with a new pair of black sandals and a couple of boxer shorts, not caring if Tayuya saw them in the same way she did. When he was finally done, the two kids dumped their piles of clothing down on the counter as the clerk very quickly sorted through them. The price flashed when the price flashed up, Naruto's eyes widened once again. 1,600 reals seemed a little steep. Then again, when he looked at the rather large pile of clothing, he realized that there was a bit more there than he thought originally. He smiled sheepishly with one hand, rubbing the back of his head before looking into his wallet with no small amount of uncertainty. Tayuya, I don't, I don't, I don't think this, I don't think I can afford all of this. Tayuya just narrowed her eyes and looked at her pile of clothes defiantly. Well, then put some of your clothes back. Naruto's eyebrows shot up at her suggestion. What? Why do I have to go back? I'm paid. Tayuya only placed her arms across her chest, smirking evilly. Nagato said you have to protect me. Naruto growled lightly under his breath. She would always pull that card if she saw an argument varying from her favor. He knew she didn't actually mean what she said, but she wasn't exactly the type who wanted to be looked after, and it was more for the pleasure of seeing Naruto squirm a little. Yeah, well, protect didn't mean cater to. The last time I checked, Naruto tried to put defiance into his words, but he couldn't help rubbing a petal mark on his wrist. How the fuck would you know, shithead? When was the last time you read the fucking dictionary? Naruto was about to retort again, not willing to lose the argument when the store clerk cut in for him. That's absolutely fine. Everything's half price today. He said it very quickly, the desperation painfully obvious in his voice. It was almost like a silent request for the two of them to just pay and get out of his store. Naruto was about to ask him about it when Tayuya sent him a warning glare. She knew he was the type to question these things. She, on the other hand, never looked a gift horse in the mouth, or at least she wouldn't after making sure it wasn't going to try and kill her, at least. The pair walked out the store with mixed feelings after packing in all their recent purchases into their packs. Naruto was still curious about the strange behavior of the few people in this town, while at the same time he was happy that Gamachan hadn't been completely emptied. Takuya was happy about getting the new clothes even if she wouldn't show it. It had been a long time since she had new clothes, bearing the shirt and pants she had borrowed from Naruto. Their shopping done, and seeing no other reason to stay in the town, despite Naruto's curiosity, the two began their way to the exit of the town in silence that matched the rest of the eerie-quiet village. They were completely ignorant to the two men that watched their progress from the darkness of the alleyway. They watched the two kids with keen interest, scrutinizing them for who they were and just what they were doing. The first man was a large, burly man with muscular ripples rippling over his body, barely constrained by his thin vest and two short pants. The other man, by contrast, was a twig, scrawnier than most girls half his age. However, he held a posture that told of speed and cunning to the trained eye. The two were practically binary opposites of one another. The larger man had long, unruly hair that traveled past his shoulders, whereas the smaller man's hair was shaved to the scalp. So, these are the kids that Conan took an interest in. It was the larger man who asked the question and looked to his smaller companion for the reply. Where the where the burlier man was impatient and only thought one step ahead of himself, the thin man was much more collected, always planning and conniving to get his ends. It would appear so. They matched the description at least. He talked slowly, as if measuring out each word for a maximum impact. The bigger man grinned broadly, excited by the prospect of what was to come. There were a few things he relished, and kidnapping was among them. The intoxicating feeling of having complete and total control over your hostage was indescribable. The other man was far more displeased. Kidnapping were too much trouble for too little reward, barely worth his time. Unfortunately, when their boss asked for something, it took an idiotic ide- or ideologically brave man to say no. I wonder what she saw in them. The thin man looked contemplatively as he carefully watched the children begin their journey out of the village. Who the fuck cares? Let's just grab them. His partner shot him a withering look, placing a hand on his bulging shoulder. Patience in all things, Kagero. We must be discreet about this, drawing attention where the information may get back to our real target would be troublesome to say the least. Kagero frowned. Mishoto was always like this, ruining his fun. He sighed but nodded meekly. He knew better than to anger his companion, having learned that the hard way when they had first been introduced. Do not worry, Kagero. You will get to have your fun in time. For now, we must observe and only observe. These children may serve to surprise us. Mishoto knew never to underestimate any opponent, no matter how young or small. Having met many of the young shinobi from the various hidden villages was enough to cement that belief. While these children hardly looked like ninja, it never hurt to be cautious. End of chapter 6.